Okay, good evening, everyone. Let's begin our weekly seminar at the Center for Institutional Studies. We are very pleased to have as our speaker tonight, Francesca Carrera, who hardly needs an introduction here. He spent productive time at the Center for Institutional Studies and remains an affiliated fellow of the center. His permanent position is at UDEM Business School in Mexico. Francisca does development, labor, inequality. His degrees are from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, from University of Chile, and PhD from the University of Sussex. And his talk tonight will be as to whether ethnic minorities suffer from grading bias. Francisca.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Leonid, and thank you everyone for being in this presentation. I'm very happy to see all of you again and happy to present this research, which has been in the making for years now, almost 3 years. We invest most of the time in the field experiment, and we still need to upgrade and finish writing the document and polish it. So all your comments and suggestions will be more than welcome. I wrote this paper with 2 colleagues from Mexico as well, who are mainly associated to the Center for Teaching and Research in Economics in Mexico City. So one of them, Sergio Cárdenas, is my former boss as well. Usually in developed and developing countries, minorities are underrepresented in higher education institutions. They start struggling during their basic formation in school. They start showing disadvantages while they're progressing in the school system. And then all this reflects into a lower participation in higher education institutions. And the more recognized and the more important these are, the lower their chances to get to the university or any other type of higher education institution, including technical and vocational institutions. In particular, we focus on the Mexican indigenous population. We have about 3% of the Mexican population are indigenous school-age children. Mexico is a big country, not as big as Russia, but we have a good amount of people. So this is not a trivial number, it's 4 million children. And by the age of 12 to 14, already 17% of them have abandoned school and they don't return to school. So before they are 15 years old, almost 1/5 of the population have abandoned school. And as a consequence, only 1 to 2% of young indigenous students access to higher education institutions. And this is very imprecise. So some optimistic people say it can be up to 3%. Some others can say it's just 1%. Of them, and this starts making the point of why is this a problem. There are not even reliable statistics about knowing how many indigenous students we have in higher education institutions. And given that there is no data available, there aren't many studies, many applied studies as well, trying to explain why this is happening and trying to explain what are the main complications they face. So I think Sergey has a question.
Yeah, so I appreciate the numbers, but can you frame it in terms of some other minorities, such as black-white gap in the US or Roma gap in the Europe or something? Is that worse than these or better than these or what?
This is much worse. I mean, the gap, for example, in the US between whites and blacks in terms of income, for example, it turns out not to be so bad. It's about, in terms of income, it's not too big. It's less than 10%, the gap. The problem is there is in wealth. So white people have a lot more wealth, and then the gap widens to about 30%. And this, of course, is a result of the education and labor opportunities they face differently across life. In Mexico, there's a very big difference in terms of indigenous and non-indigenous people, because 80% of indigenous people are in poverty. And in terms of non-indigenous people, that's less than half that proportion. So this is much worse. I'm going to give some numbers about poverty as well in the next slide. And we don't have other minorities, very clear minorities in, or very big in terms of number, minorities in Mexico. So the main division is between indigenous and non-indigenous people. African American people, we also don't have a clear number of how many we have, but it's probably less, much less than 1% of the population. There is just some small communities in the eastern part of Mexico. And so there isn't much data about this problem. So there is some qualitative evidence showing that, or arguing that adaptation and socioeconomic problems explain part of why indigenous people abandon school and they don't reach higher education as well. And by adaptation, they mean things like language. For example, 78% of schools with indigenous students have exclusively Spanish-speaking teachers. It means that in 78% of schools where indigenous students attend, they are not receiving education in their own language. And that's a big problem because many of the indigenous students, or a good proportion of them, do not speak Spanish. The other problem is that 30% of indigenous students are in extreme poverty. So 80% are in poverty, which is they don't have enough, they don't have access to house, education, a good income that could help them to get all the necessary goods and services for a regular life in Mexico. But 30% are in extreme poverty. This means they are undernourished. They don't have enough money to buy food, let alone houses or clothes, just food. That's the most disadvantaged population we have in Mexico. Some quantitative research, an old paper showed that monolingual mothers largely explain the gap in achievement for indigenous children in Mexico. So the language is an important factor in the story of why they tend to abandon school, according to qualitative and some quantitative evidence, but still there isn't much about this. So what we wonder is just, maybe there are some other things that come with language barriers that are also related to social stigma due to their socioeconomic background, due to their socioeconomic and ethnic situation, which might affect furthermore their chances to succeed. So,
Francisco, a quick question.
Yes.
So are there any other like official languages in Mexico other than Spanish? Like, are there any of these indigenous languages official, or is it only Spanish?
They're not official, but they are recognized, and we have more than 1,000 indigenous languages. And they are recognized, and it's also recognized in the Constitution that education should be provided in the students' language, in their students' language, yes.
Okay, like, do they share like anything with Spanish, or are they like completely like different?
They are completely different. I cannot understand a word if you speak to me in any native language, Mexican native
Okay.
language.
Thanks.
Francesca, just out of curiosity, can I tell us a little bit more about indigenous people in Mexico? Are they who they are? Because the Mexican nation is a mix of Spanish and indigenous people, right? So these are indigenous. How do they differ from Aztecas, or you know what I mean?
We have, I'm going to give you a bit more background specifically from the state in which we did a field experiment. But in general, there are many different native cultures. There are Aztecs, Mayans, and Otomis, and there are hundreds of these. But they're largely identified as one large group of indigenous people. The thing is that we don't really know how many of them we have, because many people, when they are asked in the surveys, do you identify yourself as an indigenous, they say no, because they know precisely that they could face discrimination. So they don't identify themselves as an indigenous person. Some censuses of languages have given us the idea that about 6 to 8% of the population are indigenous, but that's a lower bound. That's for sure a lower bound.
Okay, well, thanks. So the criterion is the language, right? Basically.
For the statistics at the national level we have now, yes.
Okay, all right.
But we know there are many more.
All right, fair enough. Thanks very much, Francisca.
Can I ask a clarification question, please?
Sure.
Possible. Just very stupid one. Just understand how it works. If the teacher looking on the person can understand what is the nationality of the person, or the person should start speaking or talking to reveal or who she or he is?
No, he or she has to start speaking.
Okay. So if there is no direct contact, the teacher can't discriminate because he can't differentiate between those people, right?
That's true.
Thanks.
But in this paper, we don't focus on the language problem, because we are observing the population, a very selected population, which is are those indigenous people who reach higher education institutions, which are a tiny proportion. We're not sure of this proportion at the national level, somewhere around 1 to 2%. Because we say, okay, they have faced all these problems during basic, primary, secondary, and high school education, language barriers, and possible other sources of discrimination. They managed to get to higher education. So we want to know what other kinds of discrimination they could face, and on what is that discrimination based. So for that, since we don't have data, we don't have good sources of data, surveys, or anything around this problem, we then conducted a field experiment to verify specifically if university professors undergrade fictitious indigenous studies. We created fictitious indigenous studies in order to try to experimentally evaluate any possible source of discrimination versus non-indigenous students. So we do this by creating fake essays that are then somehow randomized in a large university with indigenous presence in a state in specific in Mexico, which is Michoacan. I'm going to talk a bit more about this specific state in a bit. We designed as well a rich context survey for the professors in order to explore what in the literature is called the Pygmalion effect, or the self-fulfilled prophecy. So if they have low expectations previously, we want to know if they have low expectations previously to receive or to even grade some of the papers. I'm going to give, of course, more details. So this is just the general idea of what we do in this paper. So we have about 8,000 students in this university, but of course, this is an experiment, so that our sample is going to be much smaller than that. And just to mention that this is big university. And I'm also going to give you some data of how many students, indigenous students they have, or they think they have. So what do we know about this problem specifically? So there's a scarce experimental evidence, some studies, but all of them have shown a persistent bias towards minorities or people from lower backgrounds or migrants, for example. In 2012, there's I'm only citing experimental evidence. So Indian instructors graded lower castes differently versus higher castes, for example. And this is about 8% of a standard deviation in their tests. In Sweden, they use non-blind instructors versus blind instructors. So they first apply a test, it's blindly graded, and then the same test is graded in a non-blind process by other instructors, and they tend to favor national students over foreign migrant students in 20% of a standard deviation in Sweden. In Germany, they did fake essays, and they give these fake essays with last names of students from Germany, with last names from Germany, and they obtain higher grades than students of Turkish name or last name in about 10% of a standard deviation. It's not 0.10, it's 10%. And the only study for Latin America was conducted in Brazil. Again, a double process, first one blind process and then a non-blind process. But these are the same instructors, so they are not aware that these are the same tests. And so they graded Afro-descendant students with lower grades also as well, around 8% of the standard deviation. So the problem here is that the tests they used are mathematics. So because if you use other kind of tests, you cannot repeat the same exam with the same instructor, one with a name and one without a name, one in a blind process and another one in a non-blind process. So that it has to be a subject in which you cannot identify the style of the student when he's answering, right? It's more like a standardized test. So what we try to do is to mix these strategies that had been used before, and we try to improve that. And I'm going to tell you a bit more about the specific experiment in a few minutes. So a bit more of background about Michoacan. This is a state located in the center west of Mexico, with 4.6 million inhabitants. At least 6% of the population can be considered indigenous because of the language census we did like about 5 years ago. But of course, this is a lower bound, there are more indigenous people there. For example, in this specific university, about 30% of the professors we surveyed, they declare that they think about 30% of their students are indigenous. So 70% of the population in Michoacan live in cities with an average education of 7.9 years, which is really low, even compared to the national standard, which is already low, of 9.8 years on average. 38% of them, of the students in total, not of indigenous students, but in total, reach higher education institutions, but only 12% of young people finishes. If we keep this proportion equal for indigenous and non-indigenous people, that would mean that a very tiny fraction of indigenous students will finish their higher education. So surveyed professors identified that 1/3 of their students could be indigenous by the look, but they are not quite sure.
Francisco, sorry, one quick question. So you said like 6% at least of the population are indigenous in that state, but are there kind of clustered in specific cities, or are they like kind of homogeneously scattered around that state? Do you know a bit more about this?
They are not in the capital. So they're not in the capital. In the capital, you mainly have the mixed, and they tend to be whiter in that state. By coincidence, the mixed people tend to be a bit whiter, and they all live in the capital, and all the others live in other communities. So in out of the capital, which is Morelia, you can find more indigenous people. But we don't know that like exactly the dispersion and with precisely because there isn't much data about this.
Okay, thanks.
So as I was mentioning, we replicated a selective admission process to a higher education institution, which includes an essay on a common topic extracted from a standardized test. So these are essays that were graded by non-indigenous graduate students from Mexico City. So we offered a voucher in a university, recognized university in Mexico City, so that they could help us students, 20 students, reply to this call, and they wrote 20 real essays to a specific question, the same question. And then we paid 12 external evaluators from that same university to blind grade these essays using a rubric. So we would reduce variance this way. So we have 240 graded essays, and then we conducted an iterative reliability test to explore multiple combinations of evaluators and grades. I'm going to give you the precise numbers in a bit, but this gave us 6 comparable essays to be graded by 50 non-blind professors in situ or in the university in Michoacan. So at the end, we have 6 comparable essays that are going to be graded by the professors in Michoacan. This is these 52 professors that participated in the field experiment are 72% of the total professors they have in this specific campus. In this specific building, because I said there are 8,000 students, but in this building in specific, there are about 1,000 students, and they have around 70 professors in this campus. 52 of them participated in the experiment. So the interrelational index gave us, what we did was to try different combinations in order to have the biggest amount of essays with the biggest amount of graders having a good comparable grading, so that they were grading in the exact same way, the exact same essays. So after running different combinations, we've ended up having these 6 essays in which 6 graders were very similarly grading them. So these are very comparable essays. This is given by the interreliability index of 0.82, which in the scale used for this to evaluate this, if this index is good or bad, this means that there is a quasi-perfect concordance in the grades of 6 essays graded by 6 evaluators. So 6 different evaluators graded each of these essays in a very, very similar way. So these are the 6 essays we're going to use for the field experiment, that we used for the field experiment. These are the results that these 6 essays obtain. And of course, we were also interested when we made this combination of essays that they don't look similar between them, that they express a range of different abilities. And then these were randomly allocated to a cover page.
Francisco, sorry, I have a very simple question from the table before.
Yes.
So How is like the grading system in Mexico? Like, because I'm thinking like if it was the UK, for example, basically the first two are like kind of poor essays, and then you know that the 70 plus is like really good, but usually like people don't award like above 80. So like in the UK, the first two would be like bad essays, and the other four would be excellent essays, meaning that there's nothing in between. But if I think about Chile, like it's more or less linear. So I'm wondering, how does it work in Mexico?
It varies a lot by higher education institution. In this institution specifically, which helped us grade these students blindly, is more like in the UK. So if you got a 70, you are doing very well. You're okay out of 100, and 81 is someone who's excelling.
Because, well, at least from my personal experience grading, I think that like generally like coursework or exams that are bad are easy to mark, then those that are really good also are easy to mark. But I realize it always those kind of in between, that kind of 50s and 60s, at least personally find those that are harder to mark. And I can imagine that maybe in that range there's like more heterogeneity, and it comes more to like, I don't know, like personal criteria.
Yeah, so that was one of the main objectives in the when we programmed the algorithm to find these 6 essays, was that we had to have a range of different results, because this way we would try to cover a bigger proportion or a larger distribution of results. And then these essays are randomized to different covers, indigenous cover or non-indigenous cover, so that we try to mitigate that possible bias. Also, the order in we give, I'm going to give more details on that. The order in which the covers, the indigenous covers appear, is also randomized. It's not always the first one, it's not always the last one, because that could also affect how you're grading any exam, right? If you, always the first ones, you're probably more strict or less strict than the last ones, or at the end, you just want to finish and then you passed everyone, right? So what we did is to have a cover with fictional students and some data in the cover of the essay, which is full name, language, and gender. We decided to make all male students so that we don't contaminate the experiment with gender biases as well. So that was, and in this first experiment we didn't want to explore that, just focus on an indigenous, non-indigenous problem. And also because in this particular university, this is a polytechnical university, so there weren't many women in general. So teachers are not used to deal with women in general. So for ASAs per professor had Spanish names, which we took from voters list. So these are names that actually exist in Mexico. This is our control group, and 2 essays had an indigenous name and language specified on the cover. So the essay is in Spanish, but we're specifying that the original language is not Spanish. And this is the treatment. We chose these names from a catalog. So a researcher in 2006 made us a favor of build a catalog or publish a catalog of the most common indigenous names in every specific indigenous subculture. And then we validated these names with a local translator of Purépecha, which is the original language in Michoacán, or the most disseminated indigenous language in Michoacán. We also included a grading rubric for the non-blind professors to guarantee that every instructor used the same evaluation criteria, or at least to reduce variance. And the tests with cover page with indigenous names were randomly ordered across the set of 6 essays. Randomly allocated and randomly ordered, so they wouldn't grade first the indigenous ones or at the end. And we also conducted a context survey, which was very important because, as I mentioned several times, there isn't much data on this topic. So in this context survey applied to the professors, we explore factors related to information about their indigenous students' academic performance. So moreover, how they, when they were grading, if they considered previous results from their students. Like, for example, this is a student who's been doing well. And so when I grade the students who have been doing well, I tend to favor them a bit more because they have worked hard during the course. So if they declare this, they are this kind of teachers, we try to capture that. If they also use comments from other instructors when they teach, if they ask other professors, what is your opinion about this student? And if they include these opinions when they are grading, because these are, we try to identify these teachers because these tend to be teachers who are filling information before they actually grade their students. And this information could be already biased. And other factors in point B, which we directly try to measure, are prejudices and stereotypes. For example, what is their opinion about the personal look of indigenous students? What does it evoke to them? What they think about the intellectual potential of indigenous students? Questions about opinions of customs, about their accents when they speak Spanish, because of course they have a specific accent. What they think about the use of traditional dresses in the campus, and expectations regarding academic performance and behavior of indigenous students. Factors indirectly affecting instructors' expectations as well. So these are personal perceptions, not about indigenous students, but about minorities in general. So here we ask questions of the kind: would you marry someone who is not your own race? Someone who is not from your own nationality, or someone who is not from your own region? Would you integrate a mixed race family? Would you rent a flat to an indigenous person? These other kind of more life-like general attitudes toward minorities. And we also ask questions about the self-image and the perceived self-efficacy, because there's theory saying that teachers who think they're very good, they are going to try to do their best in order to improve the results of their students, regardless of their look or nationality or other circumstance. And of course, general characteristics of the instructor, such as academic achievement, the type of major they studied, if they have participated in academic mobility programs, social awareness, etc. So to build this survey, we review a lot of theories and research. So all of these questions have a background on theory. This is just an example of each of these categories and which studies and which theories were justifying including each of these questions. Most of the work was on designing the context survey. Okay, so this is just a general example. At the end, we grouped about 54 variables, many of those with categorical answers, in 3 general fields, which are direct factors, professors' perceptions coming from their indigenous students' behavior and academic performance. These are 7 variables we include in the model, where we try to find out some explanation for the causal effects we're finding. The indirect factors, which are personal prejudice and stereotypes, which are 5 categorical variables, and modulatory factors. I don't know if this word exists now that I'm reading it, but mediating factors, I think, would be better. Potentially influencing their expectations, such as their gender, teaching experience, participation in mobility programs, and whether if they think that discrimination is an actual problem in Mexico or not. Some of the results to these questions, just to give you a little taste of how they see or how they think, if they are willing to live with indigenous people, of course, there's a lot of social desirability when they reply to these questions, right? They try to give the most politically correct question. We are aware of that. And nonetheless, we find some questions which are really honest. For example, if they're willing to live with indigenous people, about 10% strongly disagrees. They wouldn't live with indigenous people under no circumstances. And when you ask them if they will have a mixed race family with an indigenous spouse, almost 50% disagrees and 10% strongly disagree. These are university professors. 10% of them, and the majority of them, have master's education. And this is very important because another problem in that has been documented in Mexico recently, with some anecdotal evidence, some small surveys. There isn't much data yet on this. Is that people think that there isn't discrimination. So they declare they wouldn't live they wouldn't marry an indigenous person, but they think there isn't discrimination in Mexico. So if you ask them directly, indigenous are discriminated, 50% think they aren't discriminated. If you directly ask them if they think there is discrimination by skin color in Mexico, 50% think there isn't discrimination. And I think this is Latin Americans in the seminar would agree with these results. Like, we tend to think that there isn't discrimination. General population think there isn't discrimination. That's a problem in the US. They have serious problems there, a gap between whites and blacks, but that doesn't happen here. I have friends who are brown. That's the usual answer in our countries.
Can I have a question? Yeah, so here, I mean, who are the people who are discriminating? How do they define themselves? I don't know, of being part of some race. I don't know how to ask this, but how can you differentiate who are like the indigenous people and who are not? Because at some point, everybody has like the roots. And how do you differentiate this by, I don't know, last names, the accent, the skin color? I don't know.
So I think it's those three factors: race, precisely, skin color, their accent, and so it's mainly those two, that by the looks, by the exterior looks and their accent. But you could be wrong, definitely. It could be someone from a different country who's migrating, and you could confuse him or her with an indigenous people. So it's merely a perception. Because of course, we all in our countries, we all have roots. Indigenous roots were a mix of many things.
Okay, thanks.
So our main estimations, given that we have a randomized assignment of assessments, we run a nice and simple OLS regression, where the dependent variable in equation one is the difference between the blind grader J tests of student I and the non-blind graded K essays of student I. And that difference is our dependent variable. And we observe how this bias is bigger or smaller depending on if the cover of the essay has an indigenous or non-indigenous name. The second equation, we add professor fixed effects. We have variation within professors, and we include the order in which the essays appeared, which was random, and it shouldn't affect the results. So we just do this in order to show that the randomization worked. And finally, we have the third type of model, which comes from this specific equation, which measures the proportion which each non-blinded essay is contributing to the overall bias. That is our depending variable, and we're going to have a vector of x explanatory variables for each k professor in the non-blind grading system. So this X set of covariates come from the direct, indirect, and modulatory factors that I explained before. So these are the direct results without the OLS models, just subtracting the averages. So the average that non-indigenous people received in the blind grade is 6 or 60, and indigenous people received 7. So this was by chance, because we randomized these. We were a bit worried that it turned out that indigenous people came with a higher score, but then this is not much of a problem, because when we observe the average for the non-blind grade, the randomization worked the same way. By chance, the indigenous essays were also the best essays, or slightly better essays. Also in the non-blind grading, which means that the randomization works. And also what we find is that the non-blind professor, they graded a bit better. So as I mentioned, the blind grading happened in a university, which tends to be more strict when they're grading. And we observed that inflation in the notes in the non-blind grading in this university in Michoacan. But what we observe is that the inflation is not the same for the two groups. For white or non-indigenous people, this is almost 1 point, and for indigenous people is half a point, more or less, that inflation. So this means when we just take the simple diff in diff, that there is a 0.5 difference in points, and this difference is statistically significant in the grades between indigenous and non-indigenous people. This is about 26% of a standard deviation. So compared to what was found in Brazil, which was an 8%, and it's more similar to what was found in Sweden, which was about 20% of a standard deviation between migrants and non-migrants in that case. So when we conduct this with the OLS models, we of course obtain the same result in the model 1, which doesn't include any restrictions. The model 2, which includes professors' fixed effects, remain the same. So this is this shows that the randomization works, and it is not coming from specific groups of professors grading. And the model 3 does not include these fixed effects and includes other controls such as gender, professors' education, and their socioeconomic background. And considering standard errors, these point estimators are statistically similar. Regarding the other results we got, I'm not going to show them all because these are very large tables with including all the different variables and combinations of those variables. So the general abstract of these results is that instructors judge based on scores from previous tests, or those instructors who declare that when they grade a student, they consider how they have been doing before. So they don't start from scratch when they're grading an essay, but they always consider the student's history, profile, or background, they increase the bias in 28%. They tend to inflate the bias. And the same for those who think that, for example, if the parents of the student went to college, that's important when they grade a student, which shouldn't matter at all if you are completely fair. I don't care if your parents were to college or not. So those teachers who declare that that is important when they're grading, they tend to, not surprisingly, they tend to inflate or tend to affect the bias. Despite the potential, we know that there is potential social desirability in the answers of this survey. They are going to, many of them are going to reply trying to be politically correct. Nonetheless, we found a strong association between those professors who think that the appearance of indigenous students reflects lack of commitment. They tend to inflate grades in 26, not the grades, the bias, increases the bias in 26%. If they are unwilling to have a mixed family, that increases the bias in 73%. They are even more biased than the other professors. Some modulating factors, female professors reduce the bias. And this has been consistently found in the literature. Female teachers tend to be more fair when grading. And some of the theories behind it is that probably as they have also faced a lot of discrimination during their own formation, that's why they tend to be more aware of how discrimination can affect performance. Teachers who perceive themselves as better teachers reduce the grading bias. Education, the more educated they are less biased. And those teachers who have certain formation in humanities or their majors are in humanities, that's when we found that it reduces almost all the bias, 90% of the bias. Probably because of their careers, they have more awareness of what discrimination means and how it is present in higher education institutions. Finally, if instructors consider that indigenous students have the same quality of education, that they have the same advantages of these advantages than non-indigenous people, these professors who are not aware of educational inequalities in the system tend also to be more biased when they're grading than other professors. So in conclusion, with a low-cost design, because many field experiments sometimes are not conducted because we think they're very expensive, but this was really low-cost design. All the cost was time in designing the process. The few Amazon vouchers we gave to the first students and the graders, which are really low cost to implement this field experiment. And we provided evidence that one factor that could help reproduce social inequalities within higher education systems. This has implications for overall social mobility. So not many indigenous people are reaching higher education institutions. And then when they reach these institutions, they are not facing the same conditions, and then they are not evaluated in the same way, or at least that's what we show with this paper. Our results update previous findings on grading bias and adds to the scarce evidence in developing countries. We just had 2 previous similar research, one in India and Brazil. Now we're adding this for Mexico. Instructors' ethnic grading bias affected fictitious students in about 0.26 or 26% of a standard deviation. And that is higher than the previous evidence for Brazil, which was 8% of a standard deviation. We found that instructors' stereotypes and prejudices are key explanatory factors, and these are possibly attenuated by education and the type of education they received. So we're thinking now that further research should aim to evaluate the impact of interventions on raising social awareness among instructors and graders, and of course, introducing blind testing. So we found that blind testing, it's a fairer system So why don't we include blind testing in across all the subjects during their careers for all the students? That is definitely better and something that is not commonly used in Mexican universities. We know that, for example, in Inglaterra, in England, I said it in Spanish. In England, that's something that happens more commonly, more regularly. Blind testing, okay. So that would be pretty much it. If you have more questions, I will be very happy.
Okay, grazie. Thanks very much, Francesca. Floor is open to questions and comments. There were several questions asked during the presentation, but I'm sure there will be more.
I just wanted to say that I think it's a very well done paper. Just, write it up, ship it. There is not much you can add.
Any questions? Francesca, it's not a question, it's an idea. And let me ask first, is there any chance you can do more of this experiment, or it's done, it's over?
But I mean, we conducted this about in 2018, so that's
okay.
Yeah.
Reason I'm wondering, when you think about biases, you observe bias, right? But why this bias occurs? There might be several explanations. One explanation is that professors have prejudices about indigenous people, blanket prejudices. And as a result, they're prepared to grade their papers lower than they would deserve otherwise. Another one is it's not prejudices per se, but it's expectations that indigenous students are weaker. And these expectations are statistically grounded, I think. So it's fair expectations, right? So these biases might be statistical. And I'm thinking I put myself in the shoes of a Mexican professor, and I get a paper and I see that the paper comes from an indigenous person. I have some evidence of that. And then I start reading this paper and I do it in good faith. But while reading the paper, I observe something wrong in the paper, something that I don't like. And the way that I'm going to give to this imperfection, this failure of a student, would depend on my expectations of how good the student is. If I'm prepared to believe that the student is bad, then as soon as I see some first evidence of something imperfect, I'm going to grade this paper lower and put it aside just to save my time. And it's a rational approach, right? You know what I mean. And at the same time, if I do not have any racial reasons to expect the student is bad, I will just as well dismiss this small failure. Well, no one is perfect, so let me read further and see what happens next. I think it might be interesting to find some evidence as to what kind of mechanism is involved in these biases. And what I would have done is, if you can manipulate the papers and have some papers where you put a small imperfection in the beginning of this paper and the rest of the paper is okay, is fine, and see how grading of these papers depends on whether graders are blind or non-blind, so on and so forth. So that might be some insight into not just the bias, but how exactly this bias works. Is it something that is based on racial prejudices, which, border racism, or it's just rational behavior of people who have some statistical expectations about who a student is and act accordingly. In both cases, you observe discrimination. And you know that something similar occurs in courts. A judge might be inclined to give greater weight to evidence that points to a person who belongs to a high crime rate group. So these biases commonly occur in courts, and these are racial biases, of course. And in law, there is a clear prohibition to use statistical evidence. So everything you use about a case should be pertinent to the case, but nonetheless, that happens all the time. For the same reason, police does racial profiling, and I wouldn't be surprised. And that police that does racial profiling, oftentimes the racial minorities police, men and women, right? Just because there are more reasons to expect if you see something fishy that this person has armor or not. If it's not too late, I think it might be worthwhile trying. That's an interesting topic as far as I can see it.
Yes.
In other words, whether this discrimination is Bayesian or blanket. That's the way I would describe it.
Thank you. Yes, I think it would be challenging to introduce that, but I think that we can randomize inside the tests the mistakes, right? So that they appear first or at the end, and that would be a way to
put an error at the beginning of the paper, and then keep the rest of the paper fine, and see if there are any differences, statistical differences in grading these papers. So I think that might be
in an essay. It could be a clear misspelling or
whatever
orthographic error, for example,
whatever.
right? Yeah, that could make it more explicit. Yes. And so this experiment is done, but what we're going to do now is it was abandoned for a bit, this paper, and then we revived it. And what we're trying to get now is funding from Spencer Foundation. We're preparing a proposal from Spencer Foundation. In the US, they tend to fund this kind of studies. So the idea is that that we can get some funding so that we can replicate this at a larger scale and in different states in Mexico as well. So all the suggestions for improvement of the experiment are more than welcome. I think can you hear me?
I can hear you, but it seems that Leonid is frozen, at least in my screen.
I think
yeah, Leonid is gone.
Leonid is gone. I think I heard his battery, probably. He ran out of battery.
Can I ask you like another question in the meantime?
Sure.
Since you are working at the moment in a Mexican university, like have you discussed or have you thought about the possibility of introducing this like a blind grading system as in the UK?
Yes, I have, and but before what I thought was to do the same experiment here in the university, so that I can offer evidence. I can have another paper and offer evidence, so that they can favor blind testing, because it doesn't happen, and we have these departmental, they call it, exams, which are at least one exam during the year is not designed by the teacher, is designed by the department, by someone else. But then the grading is done by the teacher. So you can accommodate whatever as you wish to. So you have the incentive to grade them high so that you can say that you are teaching very well, no? That even not in your exam that you didn't design, they did very well. So that the incentives are completely misaligned, and they don't have blind grading. So that's something I'm going to discuss in due time.
Very good, thanks. Please, any further questions, comments? Anything you want to ask about grading bias?
Can I have
Maria, please.
I just wonder, I do understand that it's not like about for this particular paper, but probably for future. What would you anticipate if you have not individual assignments, but people working? So for example, you have two people, and there might be different kinds of composition you might have for people for different mixture of nationalities in a group. What do you think would be a potential effect of offset? If this group, if they have one indigenous person, they would be like considered as a minority group, or how would your approach to that, if any? Thanks.
Yeah, that's interesting as well. If the composition of the group they have is different, if they are more exposed to students from different backgrounds, and they're probably teachers who are more sensitive to differences between students. But if you only have one from a different background, that could reinforce maybe the discrimination or the bias. Because he's the only one who's different, you could even pay more attention to that. So that's something probably we could try to integrate in future research. And I think this is as well something that could be done in in the paper we want to write with Bernardo, because we have data on peers and how they perform, and we also have data on, probably not for this paper but for another paper, we also have data on how many of those students recognize themselves in primary education as indigenous. So if the proportion is higher in the classroom, that could mean a different peer effect. But yeah, so I think that this interacts, of course, with the background of the teacher. So if the teacher has more prejudices, he's always going to have biases, according to what we've seen in the evidence. But probably the mix of students in the classroom, if they have more minorities in the classroom, that could make them a bit more sensible towards differences.
Slide. Probably one more minor question. Is there any interaction with gender, or there's no gender difference in terms of attitude toward and bias toward minorities?
We haven't found evidence evaluating only gender experimentally, but in this specific paper, we didn't want to include that dimension as well. So all the fake students we created were males in order to avoid confounding the results. But that is something that we are trying, but because we would have needed a larger group if we wanted to add the variable of female, and that would have made this longer and more expensive. But in this new study we want to conduct, if we manage to get the funding, we want to add that variable and probably other variables that could bring discrimination combined with indigenous background.
Francesca, if you're going to continue something of this sort, just to remind you that there is a good way to elicit truthful answers to sensitive questions, or people might be embarrassed to give truthful answers, and that's list experiment. I'm not sure if you've heard about that technique, but that might be helpful. List experiment. Does it make any sense? Or?
Yes.
Basically, you give you have a control group, you have a treatment group, and to the control group you give a list of fairly straightforward questions or statements, I would say, and you ask people with how many of these statements you agree. And then in the treatment group, you add a sensitive question and ask the question as to with how many statements in that group you agree. And if there is a statistically significant difference, that's an evidence of bias. Not of bias, but people revealing their truthful attitudes.
Truthful answer. Yes, yes.
We did it in a couple of papers, and it works quite well. So.
Yeah, I read it recently in a paper of domestic violence in Peru, and they use this method now that I remember. That's a good option, yes, to find truthful answers.
Yep, right.
Yeah, because that's one of the restrictions here is that when you directly ask in a survey, we try to organize the questions in a way that they wouldn't appear directly to the professor. Like, for example, would you live with an indigenous? Would you live with a black people? Would you live with someone from another country? Like trying to mix different things so that they wouldn't identify that we were interested on indigenous perceptions, but still they would give this politically correct answer. And with this technique, you now remind me that we can probably try to reduce that problem.
Okay, well, let's see if there is anyone else who wants to ask a question or make a comment. I see none, and that probably means that we have to wrap up. And Francesca, thanks once again for a great presentation. It was very good to have you back, and we look forward to more of that. Please come back virtual and in person. And Bernardo, by our convention, please remind us what's next.
First of all, thanks, Francisco, for the presentation, and good luck with the paper. It was good to have you here online, and hopefully we will have you offline at some point, maybe during 2021. And for next week, we have Sebastian Ottinger from the UCLA, and he's going to present his paper titled History's Masters, the Effect of European Monarchs on State Performance. So we will go back to economic history. Hopefully we'll see you all next Thursday, same time, same link. So, thanks for everyone for joining. Have a great evening and enjoy the weekend.
Thanks very much.
In Russia.